Morning, Grace. It's good to be back with you guys again this morning. Last week we took a little break and we got to listen to a great speaker from Voice of the Martyrs. Is there anybody who doesn't have notes with us today? Anybody needs notes or even a book, that Story of Hope book? If you need it, go ahead and get your hands up. The ushers will be ready to bring those around. Anybody? Oh, we have some over here. Anybody else? Okay. So we're going to be back into this story of hope this week. And as we were prepping for this week, just the thought that the Bible is it's a piece of meditative literature. It really struck me how, not meditative in the sense of emptying your mind, but meditative in the sense of filling your mind. It's a book that can be read and reread, and each time you read it, right, what happens? New things pop out. Right? This story, I don't know how many times I've read this story, but as we kind of sat in it, and as I talked to my wife, and I talked to Phil, and I talked to my kids, and I talked to my neighbor about this story, new connections, new thoughts, new understandings just filled my mind each time that I retold it, each time that I sat in it, each time that I meditated and kind of spun it around. I actually had the privilege of talking to one of the believers on Ramona this week on the phone, and they're actually teaching this same section in one of their outreaches. And so we sat there and we talked about it. And then in the end, each time I have this conversation, I always come back with, wow, isn't this story just magnificent? And isn't the God who orchestrated all these things, isn't he just awesome? And so I encourage you, as you work through this story of hope and you work through it in your home groups and you're looking at it by yourself and you're thinking, you're talking, man, meditate through it. Ponder on it, turn it around in your brain, look for the details, and the things that pop out, man, just marvel. And I think it'll bring us back to this point where we think, God, how awesome you are. And we just praise him for that. So just encouragement to you this week, just to look at it that way as this meditative literature. So 2 weeks ago, we studied about the family line of a man named Abraham, right? And in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, the Bible tells the story of mankind as a whole, right? We're talking about creation, the fall, the flood, the Tower of Babel. All these things deal with mankind as a whole. And then in chapter 11, we get to this place where man begins to build this tower trying to be like God, and then God goes down and confuses their languages. And then at the end of that, we're introduced to a man named Abraham, right? So now the Bible moves from being focused to mankind as a whole, and the story begins to focus on Abraham and his family. Okay, not that God is no longer dealing with mankind, not that he is no longer communicating in other ways to other nations, but the Bible, his story, now focuses on a man named Abraham. And God makes a series of promises to him and to his future family. And one of those promises, right, one of the most important promises, is that a descendant of his will bless all the families of the earth. And so through a descendant of Abraham, all the families of the earth, including Bob Harrison right here, will be blessed. Bob, did I catch you off guard? They'll be blessed because of a descendant of Abraham. Okay, so this is the promise. This descendant or this rescuer was the same one promised to Adam and Eve on that fateful day in the garden. And in the same way that God provided the ark, right, as a rescue boat, as a rescue vessel to those who entered, this promised rescuer would be the way in which God was going to rescue the entire world. And so as the story progresses and time unfolds, God's promise begins to come true. We see Abraham's family beginning to increase. As each generation passes, then this promise of the Redeemer, the promise of the rescuer, continues to be passed down from generation to generation. When Abraham's son Isaac has 2 sons, we learn that's through Jacob and not through Esau, that who will receive the promises. And so the genealogy of the rescuer begins to unfold. First it was through Abraham, and then Isaac, and now through Jacob. And in chapter 28, God repeats that threefold promise to Jacob. Right? He says first he's going to give Jacob the land of Canaan, right? The promised land. So he's going to give him land. And And then secondly, that his family would become a great nation. And then finally, that through Jacob's family, right, that blessing, all the families of the earth would be blessed. And so the rescuer, right, we see his genealogy begin to unfold. The rescuer was going to come or would come in the family line of Jacob. And then Jacob, in turn, has 12 sons, right? And there's this big section there in Genesis about these 12 sons. They're quite a raucous crew. Some good reading in there, things that will just boggle your mind. But quite a raucous crew. And before Jacob dies, though, he indicates that it's through the family line of Judah, so through one of his sons, Judah, that the rescuer would come. Okay? And so this genealogy begins to unpack. So one important thing to note about Jacob, though, is that his name gets changed to Israel. Okay? And so when you hear the term like nation of Israel or Israelites, all we're simply referring to is those who are descendants of these 12 sons of Jacob. So we call them Israelites or the 12 tribes of Israel. Oftentimes they refer to them as Hebrews. But these are all simply just referring to the line that comes from Jacob, the 12 descendants. And so Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they all live these semi-nomadic lives in the land of Canaan. And that's the promised land. But in the later years, there's a famine that strikes Canaan. And so this family line of the rescuer moves down to Egypt. And initially, the Egyptians treat them well due to one of Jacob's sons named Joseph. And I know I'm just flying over that right now. But if you want, read in Genesis at the end there. It's a big, huge section about Joseph. Right? And you can see some patterns of this rescuing God in Joseph's story right now. But we're gonna just pass over that. And so this family is in Egypt. And at the time that Jacob moves his family to Egypt, they were a group of about 70. Okay, they were a group of about 70. But if we fast forward 350 years later, the Israelites have now become a family of 2.5 million. But they're still in Egypt, and they're still not in the promised land. And then things began to take a dangerous turn for God's people. A new king or a new Pharaoh comes into power, and he doesn't remember who Joseph, son of Jacob, was. And he doesn't even really care. But what he does remember, what he does see is how powerful, how many, how big, how large this group of Israelites has become, and how powerful they've become. And what he does think is he starts to ponder, what would happen if we're attacked? These guys would probably join our attackers against us. These guys would probably join against them. And so fear grips his heart as he decides, what do I do with this nation that lives inside of my kingdom? What will I do? And so Pharaoh, king of Egypt, he devises this twofold plan, both to enslave the Israelites and then to wipe out a whole generation of Hebrew boys and to stop their multiplication. So the plan was not only a plan of Pharaoh, but this plan was a demonic plan. It was a plan an attempt to once again wipe out this family line of the rescuer. But God, using the weak things of the world to shame the wise, he uses these two Hebrew midwives to trick and fool Pharaoh out of it. So in desperation, Pharaoh makes this startling, this like maniacal decree. He calls on all Egyptians. Right? He's no longer looking for the midwives to help. He's looking on his people, on all Egyptians, to put down the Israelites. And he commands them to seek out the Hebrew baby boys, to seek them out, and to cast these infants in the Nile River. And just let that settle a little bit. That type of decree, where does that come from? Right? To destroy this whole line, this whole generation of Hebrew children. You know, what a diabolical, what an evil character this is. Right? And so far in our story, this is probably the worst character we have encountered so far. So Pharaoh wanted the Nile River to be a place of death for the Hebrew people. But instead of death, out of the Nile River, out of this death was going to arise a rescuer. And you can imagine, right, the fear of a pregnant Hebrew mother as she walks along the banks of the Nile River, right, feeling, maybe she's washing clothes or getting water for her family, but as she feels this baby inside of her move and kick and wiggle, you got to think that fear just grips her heart, right, because she doesn't know, right, no ultrasounds then. She must have thought, is this a boy? And if it is this river his destiny? It had to have been a powerful reminder for her, just desperation. Would the hope for her future be thrown into that muddy river? And little did they know that God had heard their cries, and he was sending a rescuer. Their hope would not be thrown into the river, but their hope was actually to come out from the river. God was sending a rescuer. He had heard. And Pharaoh didn't catch God by surprise. Satan didn't pull the wool over God's eyes. God knew that this was happening. He knew the evil in Pharaoh's heart. He even knew it long, long before. If we flip back to Genesis 15, 13 through 16, and I'll put it up on the board if you don't want to flip there. But if we look back to the story of Abraham, right? We're talking generations before. When God's making this promise to Abraham in chapter 15 of Genesis, verses 13 through 16. So God's in the middle of making a promise to Abraham about his descendants and about the threefold promise. And he says this. Then the Lord said to Abram, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. And they'll be servants there, and they'll be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. But as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquities of the Amorites is not yet complete." And so in the days of Abraham, God knew that this very moment was coming. Right? He brought them into Egypt to avoid famine, and they prospered there for many, many years until this Pharaoh came to power. And now God was going to bring them out. So the season of choice for the nations in Canaan, right? We're talking about the Amorites there, or the Amalekites. Remember when he said the sins of the Amalekites hasn't quite reached its fullness yet? And so in God's patience, right, their season of choice hadn't quite yet come to an end, even though God knew it would. He knew what they would choose. He kept his people from entering that land until their season of choice was ending. And so now that season of choice had ended, and God was about to act and to take the land of Canaan back for his people. So we enter a new rescuer, a new type of rescuer. This new rescue plan had a new type of rescuer, right? Noah built an ark and he sealed it with pitch, right? This huge boat that rescued his 8-person family. Well, now, Moses, a baby boy, right? A small baby boy, Moses enters on a small boat sealed with pitch, and he's about to save an entire nation. An entire nation. Moses' parents, they weren't fearing Pharaoh's evil edict. They hid Moses for 3 months. And when they couldn't hide him any longer, Moses' mother has a plan, and she puts Moses in this small raft made of reeds, and she sets her small child into the Nile near the place where Pharaoh's daughters would bathe. You can imagine even that as a mother putting your 3-month-old baby down into the water, right, hoping that it's going to catch the eye of Pharaoh's daughter, and somehow, and she probably didn't know exactly how, but somehow praying that God would rescue her little boy, Moses. And so seeing the basket and then opening it and hearing this pitiful cry of a 3-month-old, Pharaoh's daughter, we see she's moved with pity. And knowing it's one of the Hebrew babies, the princess sends the child's sister, who was lurking in the weeds. And she sends her sister to go find someone who could nurse this child. And so the sister goes straight to her mom. Yeah. And you can imagine, think about the reunion. Just put yourself in that position, in the reunion, as Moses' mom holds 3-month-old Moses to her breast at that time. Just thinking, man, how much God rescued, how he provided. Right? Her joy, I would love to see the picture of her face. Right? Her smile as she held her baby again, the one that went into the river to die but came out as the rescuer that would lead his people. And so through the weakness of a baby's cry, the strength of Pharaoh was put to shame. The evil attack by Satan was about to be derailed by what? The birth of a baby. That's right, Ember. The birth of a baby is about to derail the evil plans of Pharaoh. So out of the Nile rose a man who was to rescue his nation. Moses, we read again, he's weaned and he grows up in the house of Pharaoh, the instrument that God would use to rescue his people, living along the instrument that God would use to punish the Egyptians. Right? This story is full of these contrasts that you see. The instrument that God is going to rescue with, living and growing up right alongside a new Pharaoh, who would be the instrument that God would punish the Egyptians. But at the age of 40, so Moses grows up and he's educated in the house of Pharaoh. He lives a life of a prince. Right? He grows up with the finest things, the finest education. But at the age of 40, when he finds out one of his fellow Hebrews, he goes out and he sees him being beaten by a slave master. And so Moses, possibly in a fit of rage, he goes and he strikes and he kills the slave master. And then he realizes what he just did. He'd killed an Egyptian, him still a Hebrew. And so Moses is afraid and he flees, right? He runs, he gets out of there to a place called Midian. And then for the next 40 years of Moses' life, he becomes a shepherd. Right? He moves from a prince living in a palace or a noble house or someplace nice. And for the next 40 years, he lives the life of a semi-nomadic herdsman, guiding his sheep through the land, seeking out pastures for his flocks to graze, all the while protecting and guiding them, keeping them safe from dangerous animals. And it's on one of these trips, as Moses is out through the desert, that he comes upon something that just baffles him, something that draws him in, something that makes him very curious. Right? He sees this bush that's consumed with flames, but the fire never went out. And I can't help but think he actually had some practical thoughts at that point. I can't help but think he thought, man, you know what, if I bring this bush home to my wife, like no more getting firewood, no more. I actually think maybe he initially had these practical thoughts, but as he goes closer, right, out of the bush comes what? God's voice. Notice all the kids are answering these questions, right? They're good. So out of the bush comes this voice, and it's God saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Right? God's introducing himself to Moses, connecting this genealogy with who he is. Who he is. And I have heard my people, and I know their sufferings, and I'm going to rescue them. Right? I'm going to bring them into the land that I promised to their forefather, Abraham. And then God unpacks this rescue plan for Moses. Right? And you got to think, as Moses is listening to this, so much new information coming at him, a bush that's burning, God talking to him, and he listens to this rescue plan. Moses and his brother Aaron, they're going to be the ones to go, and they're actually going to go back to Egypt. Moses is. And they're going to speak to Pharaoh. And although they will do these signs and wonders, they're going to do a lot of miracles, that Pharaoh's not going to budge. They're going to ask Pharaoh to release the Israelites, but Pharaoh's not going to do it. He will need to be compelled by a mighty hand. Right? That's what God actually communicates that to Moses. He says they're going to need to be compelled by a mighty hand, and God will be that hand, the hand that compels Pharaoh. And so Moses returns to Egypt, and they enter the courts of Pharaoh, and he communicates to Pharaoh what God said. Pharaoh was to free God's people. There was no way around it. But instead of freeing the Israelites, Pharaoh actually orders them to work harder. And Moses again goes to Pharaoh, and he again repeats his message. But again, Pharaoh refuses. And this time, Moses and Aaron, right, they perform a series of miracles, one with a snake and a few others. They perform this series of signs. But then Pharaoh's magicians, they copy them in a similar, sometimes less way, but they copy them. And so Pharaoh's heart remains hard, and he does not listen to Moses. He does not listen to God. And so to demonstrate his power over the false gods of Egypt, to convince Pharaoh to release the Israelites, that God executes a series of dreadful plagues on the land of Egypt. And the first two plagues, number 1 and number 2, they're repeated in a somewhat less fashion by the magicians of Pharaoh. And if you want, on your way out, I printed off this copy of the plagues. And in this page you can see there's actually a deity or an Egyptian god that these plagues are specifically going after. And so in your home groups, I'm not going to go through them here, but in your home groups, if you want, you can grab them up front here. I have a bunch, or on the way out, the ushers have them. And just looking this over and seeing how actually it is God taking aim one by one at these deities of Egypt, these gods of Egypt. So he's demonstrating his power over these false gods. And so Pharaoh's heart, it continues to remain the same. Right? He refuses to obey God, refuses to release the Israelites. But after the third plague, the magicians of Pharaoh, right, his people, his advisors, they throw up their hands. And they actually are very honest, and they warn Pharaoh, and they say that this is the very finger of God, Pharaoh. They're like, listen up. Moses was renowned in the land of Egypt for the things and the plagues and the signs that happened. And so even his closest advisors, Pharaoh, they begin to say, hey, listen up. This is that hand, right? This is the very finger of God who is on this. But Pharaoh's heart, it remains hard, and he refuses to let the Israelites go. Right? His heart is hardened by himself. And he refuses. And so plague 4 and plague 5 come with the same pattern, right? God commands. Pharaoh rejects. And then God sends a plague, and Pharaoh's heart remains hard. And it was the 6th plague where things began to play out in a different manner. In the 6th plague, we see some different things happening. Instead of Pharaoh hardening his own heart, we now see a movement where God begins to harden Pharaoh's heart. And so Pharaoh has reached the end of his season of choice. Right? God came to him with signs, with miracles, with plagues, and Pharaoh continued to harden his heart. And then we see after this 5th plague that God closes the season of choice. Right? His season of choice has come to an end, and now Pharaoh has become an instrument of wrath. God's the one that closed the door. God's the one that ended this season of choice for him, and now he was going to use Pharaoh to punish the Egyptians and to show his absolute power over their gods. And so this new pattern repeats itself in plagues 6, plague 7, plagues 8, and plagues 9, until we reach this final plague. And in this final plague, God was going to kill the firstborn son of every creature in Egypt. And from the lowest son of a slave to the very offspring of Pharaoh himself. And there was only one way to be rescued from this judgment. Go ahead and turn your Bibles to Exodus 12, and we'll read this. Exodus 12. We're going to read verse 21 through 28. So this is Moses speaking to the leaders of Israel. And then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go and select lambs for yourselves, according to your clans, and kill the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch it to the lintel, to the 2 doorposts, with the blood that is in the basin. None of you shall go out of your door of his house until morning, for the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your house and strike you. You shall observe this rite as a statute for you and your sons forever. And when you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service. And when your children say to you, 'What do you mean by this service?' you shall say, 'It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. For he passed over the houses of the people of Egypt when he struck the Egyptians, but he spared our houses.' And the people bowed their heads and they worshipped. And in the people of Israel they went out and they did so as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. They did so." So God commanded and he communicated to Moses what to do, right? How to be rescued. And Moses then communicates it to the people of Israel. They were to take a lamb. And they were to take this lamb and they were to set it aside for death. This lamb was to be set aside to die. Right? It had to be a perfect lamb. A lamb without blemish. The lamb could be taken from either the sheep or the goats, but the lamb had to be male. The lamb was to be watched between the 10th and the 14th days to be sure that it was the right lamb, or to be sure it was the one without blemish. And then they were to kill this perfect lamb, and they were to spread its blood on the doorposts and on the lintel of their house. And then they were to enter the house, and they were to stay under the blood. They were to stay under the blood of this lamb until morning. And then they were to roast the body of the lamb on the fire, and they were to eat its flesh in entirety because they would need its sustenance for their journey. The blood of this lamb was to save them from death. Right? It wasn't the example of the lamb that was to save them. It wasn't the life of the lamb that was to rescue them. It was the death of the lamb that provided the blood and rescued them. And it was the body of the lamb that was to give them life for their journey. The Israelites, we see that they believed, right? And they responded in obedience to the words of the Lord. So each man took the life of a lamb, and they spread the blood over their doorposts and the lintel of their house. And it was this visible sign of their belief in what God had said. And it wasn't so with the Egyptians until the final showdown begins. And about midnight, Pharaoh must have awoke as he begins to hear this strange sound echoing through his land. Right, one here and then another one over there. As the sounds join together in this awful wailing of despair as the households of Egypt begin to wake up and discover their firstborns dead. And possibly Pharaoh, in a moment of clarity, puts things together in his mind, and he wakes up and he runs down the corridors of his palace into the room of his son and finds him cold and dead. Right? The sounds must have been haunting that night to those huddled together safely protected under the blood of the Lamb. Must have been haunting. So next week, we're going to continue the story. Right? This is this big epic story of the Israelites getting taken out of Egypt. So next week, we're going to finish this story, but there's two things I wanted to bring out and to highlight during this time. The first is that those that were under the blood were the ones that were rescued. Right? The blood was important. It wasn't this life of the lamb, right? They didn't hold the lamb up and say, hey, well, we got the lamb right here. We didn't want to kill it. No, it was those who were under its blood, right? The lamb had to die. They were under the blood. And those who were outside the blood were not, right? In this Passover, this is something that God wanted them to repeat over and over and over and over again. It is something that he wanted drilled into their heads. He wanted them to teach their kids and their grandkids, right? That it was through the blood, right? Remember that it was through the blood and this lamb that was killed on their behalf, that died, that they were rescued. So it was a picture of the way that God would bless the nations of the world through a descendant of Abraham's family. And then secondly, we see that response reveals their belief. Right? Response reveals belief. So God reveals himself to mankind, and then mankind is given a season of choice, a season of time where they can choose to respond to God in belief, or they can choose not to. You know, it's God who closes the door, and he's the one that ends this season of choice. And Pharaoh is a perfect example, right? We even can contrast two pharaohs. Do you remember the story of Abraham, right? When he goes down into Egypt, and he gives Sarah to Pharaoh at the time, the king at that time. And then what happens to that king, right? There's plagues that come on his house, and then he does what? How does he respond? He gives Sarah back, right? So God gives plagues on his house. He realizes these are from God. He realizes he needs to do something, and he gives Sarah back. So he responds rightly. So then fast forward to the Pharaoh we're looking at now. Okay? God shows himself to Pharaoh, doesn't he? He shows himself. He proves himself. There's even his advisors say, look, this is the finger of God. But what does he do? He doesn't respond rightly, does he? He hardens his heart. And then God, being the one who controls the season of choice, he ends it. Right? God's the one that closes the door, just like we saw with the time of the flood. Right? He came to those people. He showed himself through Noah. Noah preached and told the people to come in, that there was going to be a flood, a warning. But did they respond? And then God closed the door. Right? God's the one who closes the door of the season of choice. And I think for us, right, how more applicable that is to us. Right? Maybe you're here today and you haven't trusted in the rescuer. Maybe you haven't put your faith in him to make you right before God. Right? It's a warning. These stories are a warning as well. That we do have a season of choice, like the Amalekites and like Pharaoh, and we have a season of choice, right? God reveals himself to us, but it's our choice whether we choose him or not. And so if you're hearing this today for the first time, or you're maybe for the first time being confronted with this, man, choose wisely and choose today, because we don't know when this season of choice will end. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we just do thank you for your love for us. We thank you that you give man a season of choice in your goodness. We thank you for your word, that it's meditative, that it speaks to us, that it's unlike any other book that can only be read once, that your word can be read and meditated on and sifted through and discussed, and yet still we see truths that we just have in mind. We thank you for your love and your provision. We ask these things in your name. Amen.